let's go, mate. That's how we're starting it, because we're done with the cheesy intros. No, it's too much pressure. Like, the whole point of these things are supposed to be organic and the natural flow of conversation is like, hey there, radio DJs, welcome to another episode of Filling the Blank. How are you, sir?
Mate, I'm really well. Thank you for asking. How are you doing as well? Because I don't like to just assume that because I'm a guest that it's just, I don't want to just talk about me. I'm sure I'll happily share some stuff. But how are you doing, mate?
There's a lot of bit to do with you. Yeah, no, I'm good. Genuinely, I'm good. Yeah, I've the house to myself, as I said to you today. My setup's slightly different, and I'm just so. Start with the tangent, because that's naturally how it goes. My 2-year-old, bless him, is like a Wreck-It Ralph. Everything he touches breaks at the moment. So the house is a mess. There's no point in replacing anything, fixing anything. It's only temporarily. He's broken our living room door.
Oh, good.
So whereas I would normally close the door, and Daisy, the hyper Cocker Spaniel, and very needy Cocker Spaniel, she's just like her dad, she wants my attention whenever I'm talking to someone. So she just noses the door open. So I'm expecting a bang, followed by her just crying and pouring at my leg.
Right, we keep it real here, man. You know, if dogs come wandering in, what was it? There was that amazing clip a few years back of the guy who was being interviewed on the news, and then like his baby just or his toddler just strolled in like mid interview and just wrecked the whole thing. So if we got to have some of that going on, mate, that's all good.
Yeah. I think that was one of the sweeter ones. I think there was also another one, a guy being interviewed for the news, and he turns around and goes, "Get the fuck out! I'm live on the news." That's why I thought he was going with the toddler. I was like, I'm pretty sure he didn't say that. Maybe he did. How are you with things? Like, where are you at with all at the moment? Because I wanted to get you on specifically just because my main aim with this thing is just to get people on I'd love to have a chat with and grab a coffee with anyway. Unfortunately, distance and timings and all those things come into play. So I was curious as to your space of Man's Coach and what got you in there and why you feel that's so important now, because it's a bit of a personal passion of mine, because I do think it's a bit of a weird time, cue the world's smallest violin, for men in finding their place in the world and what's expected of them, what most people find acceptable, what people find unacceptable, which they are very vocal about these days, understandably so for some reasons, others less so. I was introduced not so long ago by this term concept creep. Are you familiar with this? No. How definitions broaden over time, essentially. So something with quite a strict or a very definitive meaning and description years gone by. So something like, let's use something that relates to what we're talking about. So misogynist was simply you hate a woman, right? And generally that leaks out in every sort of behaviour, how you talk about them, talk to them. Whereas how, I guess, concept creep has consumed that, it's become a little bit more from a subjective perspective, and rightly so. People are called out for the misogyny. There's some incredibly misogynist men, there are incredibly misogynist women, but also mild disagreement with someone that is a woman doesn't make you a misogynist, which sometimes we love a label, people are labelled as. So where does misogyny, misandry, like everyone loves throwing around terms, I'm not sure many really think about what those terms mean and the impact they have on the people they're talking about, because men especially are discussed quite flippantly sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
That's my guess anyway.
Yeah, where to begin, man? First of all, wonderful topics, and I think just to speak to what you said about like how terms kind of evolve, I think it's a natural process. So things like whether we're talking about misogyny or even concepts like masculinity, I think one of the reasons that these terms and definitions kind of evolve and expand is because the way that we're taught them in history are often like in a very simplified way. They are, the iteration of that term or the definition of that term at that given time. But as we start to, we're in probably the most curious generation, or definitely challenging. We like to challenge. We like to question things more than ever. That's certainly something that we see more and more through the realms of social media. And obviously that can become quite messy and it can become complicated. But I think nuance exists, and so many of us are actually just trying to find the nuance and find, more and more detail to understand things. There's definitely like a big desire to label things, because I think if you look at things like the mental health conversation, being able to understand symptoms like depression and anxiety have given people, they give people something to understand themselves through. And I think that's ultimately what we're deeply trying to do, all of us, regardless of who we are, how we identify, our gender identity, sexuality, race, everything. We're trying to understand, and we're trying to find our place in the world. And I think that's one of the things that drives our need to define ourselves. But things like misogyny, if you go back maybe even 15, 20 years, something like wolf whistling at a woman in the street would just be generally considered banter or a bit of fun, a bit of lighthearted play. But obviously, as we become more aware around things like, the very real threat that women feel and the very real threat that women face, around male violence towards women, sexual assault, all of these sorts of things, which historically aren't discussed, well, it allows us to kind of, I guess, broaden or deepen or challenge, these behaviours, and then they begin to, be adopted into that expanded definition of something like misogyny. Now, it's hard work because it's hard to keep up with. It's really, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is that our brains only operate at a certain level. They're fucking brilliant human beings and the way that our brains work, but our language often limits us, and we struggle to keep up with our brain's need to process and understand things within the language that we have. So, definitions are hard, and labels are, something that we feel more called towards than ever, but we're finding it harder and harder to define and kind of make them rigid. And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems that we are having. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, there's loads in there. Thank you. Perhaps it's because you echo a lot of my biases, if you like, that I'm sitting here nodding and things like that. But I do think there's some interesting further discussion within that, because also there doesn't need to be a clear definition of a lot of these things. I think, as you say, labels are clearly helpful. If you feel alone in the world, you feel like you're the only person, you feel like you're suffering in silence, to find a tribe, a troop, an echo chamber of people that are, whether it's distinctly different or they're experiencing something very similar to you, can be enlightening, not only just from a learning perspective, but also just feeling like you have a community, that you're not the odd one out, so to speak. But also with labels, they can become a bit self-defeating or self-fulfilling. People, we see how people define themselves in their bios, and we can go into whether that's helpful or harmful and all of those kind of things. So I think there's always an air of caution when you distinctly associate your self-worth, your soul being, and your identity with any one thing, because at some point that's going to be threatened, either because you want to change it or you're forced to change it. So if you're a bodybuilder, you decide you're not a bodybuilder one day, and all your self-worth is tied into being a bodybuilder. How does that leave you feeling? If you're a husband and then one day you're not a husband, like all of these things I think are at risk. And that kind of brings me on to this idea of threatened masculinity, and why men are kind of floundering, or some men are floundering, to find a place in the world and find representatives, which is why they're clinging on to less helpful narratives, let's say. And at the extreme end, you've got the incel, and at the I don't know, the lesser end, obviously still something I don't particularly agree with, but the certain Tates of the world, or the Trumps, or the, just generally, I guess, that more archaic type bloke that is, even if not always a misogynist, we can all agree is probably a bit inappropriate at times. But they seem to be the spokespeople for men, or a lot of men, and people cling on to their ideas because there's not real representation in the nuance, or public representation, I should say, because it's only the polarized that gets elevated to a certain platform that gets their voice heard. The conversation that you and I have, they're not really getting out there, which is, what I hope that we both choose to do a better job at communicating that online. But it's whether that gets out there to the ears, that's another story.
Exactly. We the what you've said about men like Tate, Trump, these kind of like extremists, ultimately very misogynistic, old fashioned by way of thinking, but obviously have a lot of quote unquote success. So that's one of the things that lends them as potential role models or leaders to so many men who are lost and struggling. Like, we're in a time, and I don't think, look, I'm not going to speak about this time like I know about our generation and I know about all of them previously. I think it's safe to say that the world that we live in is as a result of generations of, poor, kind of really embodied, heart-led leadership from like the man side in the world. If you look at the last 2 or 3 generations, you'll see, the men that I work with, for example. So I work with men around my age who are struggling with things like they've got all of the external success, they've got a strong career, they make good money, they've probably got a relationship, they might be married, they might have kids. But there's deep down, there's this kind of murmur and this like whisper in this, and it gets louder, that there's something missing and that there's actually no fulfillment in life. They're missing something, and it starts small, but then it becomes a panic. And that's because they followed a path that was set out for them rather than choosing their own. And so you've got men who actually don't have any degree of self-trust, self-confidence. They don't have, attributes around things like courage, conviction, all of these things that, regardless of your gender, these are attributes that serve you in the world. And when we get stuck into our work, a lot of the stuff that comes up is what happened to our dads, and how our dads, how our fathers, or the lack of things like emotional safety, how emotionally reactive and angry and unpredictable their family household was. So as a result, a lot of our generation has become quite very people-pleasy. We're quite hyper-vigilant and emotionally sensitive, and we're kind of now dealing with this struggle of learning how to navigate that and step outside of the kind of power dynamics that our families and particularly our dads have on us. And then you keep going back and you go, well, hang on a minute. If they've done that to us, what happened to them? And it's just like, you can keep going back, and, the generation before our fathers will be the ones who were, children or young adults during the war. And the fact that back then you didn't have a mental health conversation. You didn't have terms like PTSD. You had, a generation of guys who went to war, came back and suffered with something called shell shock. And,
it's thrown back to the street and just...
Exactly. So I appreciate this is quite a bit of we're touching on many topics here, but I think you can continue to trace it back, and it will keep coming back to the fact that there is no strong, embodied, grounded, male role models and leaders in the world. Politicians, we've just seen, 4 years of, quite frankly, a bloke who got voted as president, and 5 days before he got voted as president, was shown, a video went viral of him saying you can grab a woman, you can grab women by their genitalia and you can basically sexually assault them and you can get away with it. So it's just, these are all symptoms of the fact that we don't have, and I'm going to use, my opinion here, which is the right type of men standing up, stepping up and leading in the world. And so coming back to, I guess, labels, that is why I think labels can definitely help us, because they do help us, they help us understand ourselves. But I think one of the problems that we have, and this is the kind of flip side of that coin that you were kind of alluding to, that it can be helpful and harmful, is that when we over-identify with labels, we do a lot of that often because we are trying to find our place in the world. But when we find our place in the world, we start to see other places and other people as threats to that place. And that is I think where the problem comes in, because I mean, one of the best practices that I've started doing over the last few years is that I've started looking at what my labels are. So if we were to look at my own labels, I am white, I am male. My gender identity is that I identify as a man, because there are people who are born as men or are given assigned to the gender of boy or man, and then obviously transition. So I'm cisgendered, I'm white, I'm male, and when I do that, what I then do is I go, well, who isn't part of those groups? Who can I follow, or who can I learn from, or who can I get curious about, who is maybe a person of color? People of different, come from different countries and backgrounds, people of different gender identities, people of different, abilities or disabilities. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to step outside of this little echo chamber, because it'd be really easy for me to just surround myself with, white, first world, fairly successful blokes, like you and I. It'd be really easy for me to sit and have conversations with blokes like you and I, and just surround myself and make that my network and make that the arena and echo chamber from which I gather all of my thoughts and my opinions and my beliefs about the world. But tuning into different voices and different backgrounds and different cultures, it allows you to recognize, don't get me wrong, it can be fucking scary and it can feel threatening, but actually what you end up doing is when you start listening a little deeper, you realize that actually everyone's coming from the same, everyone struggles, everyone's going through shit, and everyone is also scared of those other labels feeling like they feel like a threat to them. So that is just a big ramble, and I'm sure that hopefully there's some value in that, but what do you think?
No, I think there's so many valuable points there, because there is that you can be subjected to, and I don't mean this as a slight to where I grew up, but I guess it was, I'm trying to say it in the politest sense, kind of small town mentality, in that it is, I liken this to kind of how a lot of people experience as well, especially if you're not on social media and things like that, is you are limited to your world experiences, and it's not until you show a vested interest into understanding other people's experiences that you actually challenge your beliefs about them. We can talk about racism, we could talk about sexism, we could talk about all these other things within that. And I think a big part of, my development is just getting out of that when I went to university, not intentionally, but just experience a lot of the world. So my background, I'm Turkish Cypriot, all my family from Northern Cyprus. So there are some generational, I guess, cultural differences that I was always subjected to, which I thought were a bit of a norm. There were some parallels with growing up in where I did in Essex, but there wasn't really many ethnicities, like people of colour around. So it wasn't something I was that subjected to until I went to university, and that's where the learning comes in. Something else that you spoke about which really resonated with me was, especially in therapeutic terms, there's many discussions around kind of the mother wound, if you like, but not so much around the father wound and the impact that has on people. We talk about, boys or girls and the relationships to their mum, and the mum's always the forefront of the conversation of being such a crucial, and rightfully so, vital role of that child development, especially in their formative years, but less so the dad's responsibility. And we see generations gone by, as I still know men around our age that kind of pride themselves on little things, like they seem seemingly benign, but I guess it feeds into their beliefs around certain gender roles. So they're quite proud they've never changed a nappy, for example, or they still refer to looking after their child as daddy daycare, and like they want the biggest pat on the back for just, I don't know, like picking their child up and things like that. That is still a belief, because when you were saying echo chambers and sticking to men like us, I still would say we're probably not like the status quo. I don't want to say the status quo. I think there are many other men that are curious about this stuff, or they've grown up and they've thought, yeah, like that person I'm supposed to look up to, that person is supposed to be a man, but actually there's so many aspects of being like that just doesn't resonate with me. That doesn't feel right.
Yeah, definitely. No, I completely agree. And I think what you're speaking to there is that you and I are, again, first of all, we're not fucking, God's gift, and we're not perfect, right? But I think you and I have we both agree that within the realms of our work.
I'm a deeply flawed human, James. I'm a deeply flawed human.
But like within the realms of our own journeys around, like, what we're talking about here is self-awareness, right? You and I have both agreed that we question certain things about who we are, and you've already been able to differentiate yourself from, I was talking about, let's say, like those labels, right? So white, 30s, sort of, are you in your 30s? You are. Oh, it's just.
Oh, sorry,
that's all right. I was just saying, like, we're white, we're in our 30s, and I was like, are you in your 30s? Yeah,
I am. I don't know whether I should take that.
Well, I assumed you were.
But yes, I am.
But saying, like, and again, no, I'm assuming that, and I am, want to make sure I'm assuming right here that, you're a straight white man. So we fit those kind of similar, things, right? But the self-awareness piece is where we begin to differentiate. You and I have both gone on a bit of a journey to understand ourselves at a bit of a deeper level, and that's probably where you're starting to see differences between, many other straight white men who might be a similar age and a similar background. So, I think, the self-awareness piece is probably where there's a difference.
What sparked your curiosity, if you don't mind me asking? What sparked your curiosity in that? Because it seems, I find it's really cliche, but often it's the work that I do with people. It's slightly different, but there has to be that element of self-awareness, because I like to work with individuals on their self-leadership, which is essentially, from a coaching perspective, is you haven't really done your job if someone doesn't part ways with you sometime, because you are working towards that. They feel empowered. They recognise they've got the agency, that they can carry things forward on their own. But there has to be that curiosity around it. So with that, you have to have quite an introspective, I don't think it's a natural thing. I think it's something that's happened in your life, or enough instances of that doesn't resonate with me. I don't feel part of the pack. I feel like an outsider. I'm definitely experiencing the world quite different to everyone else around me. I need to explore this. And for some people that spills over in maybe mental health, it may be certain behaviours, it may be identified by other people, it may be escapism in things like addiction, with porn, drugs, like all of these other things that feed into it. Because I do think some people are so immersed in their real world experience, they don't really, not consciously, is the way the world is, they don't have the ability to pause. Something about this isn't quite right. They're just in it. And a lot of us are just surviving day to day. Is I've got to get through the day. I've got to go to work. I've got the kids off in time. I've got to make a certain amount of money. I've got to buy a certain house. I've got to meet my friends and socialise. I must get as pissed as possible because that's what everyone else does. They're not really thinking about, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. Like this can't be it.
Absolutely, man. I mean, I would say my experience was very much, how far do you go back? I always, growing up, always felt like I was always felt like I was a very sensitive kid, very, very emotionally sensitive, and definitely felt a lot of anger, frustration. Growing up, I'm talking like, as a child. A lot of this could be the stories that I was told about my childhood as well. As I grew up being a teenager, we all go through challenges, during our teenage years. But the real kind of, like, I remember about 16 or 17, it was just after my mum and dad had separated. I remember, like, my anger was, like, really, really severe. And I actually booked myself a doctor's appointment and said I need to speak to someone. And, ended up getting some therapy sessions through the NHS. And that was my first time where I'd sort of spoken to someone about how I was feeling outside of my family unit, and started to, I think at the very least, I knew that something didn't feel right internally. But it was probably a good 6 or 7 years. It was about 24. I went through, my first, like, absolute capitulation, like existential crisis, complete mental health breakdown. And, like, I questioned everything. I went through a process of questioning, like, genuinely, do I want to be here on this planet? The answer a lot of the time was no. Who am I? What am I here for? I questioned things like, do I like myself? Who am I? I questioned things like, what do I want to do in this world? Like, I questioned my sexuality, all sorts of things. And it was all off the back of, a relationship that I was in at the time. We'd been dating for like 6-7 months, and then she went traveling. She left me. And it triggered something within me that was absolutely, I had no idea it was in there. And I crumbled. Went on a journey. I went through like a period of chronic depression for about 2 years. It was a fucking awful time. Figured out some stuff kind of at the end of, like that about 2.5 year period of depression. Found my way back to myself a little bit. I think had a period of reflection and introspection about my own mental health. And then after that, I think it was so that would have been sort of 2015, 2016. I spent a couple of years kind of in therapy and trying to figure out stuff about who I was and what was going on internally within me. And then in 2018, unfortunately, a very, very dear friend of mine that I'd spent about 3 or 4 years being very close with, it took his own life. And it was a real, real shock to, everyone that knew him. But out of all of his friends and anyone within his network, I think I'd begun to, over the previous few years, been quite vocal about my mental health. I've been talking, I put up a couple of posts on social media. I really found the healing from speaking up and speaking out about, what is ultimately something that's very stigmatized, feeling depressed and feeling lonely and all this stuff. And, my friend Harry and I had spent we'd spent about 3 years being very good friends. Most of our friendship was heavily based in a lot of alcohol consumption, a lot of recreational drug use. It was that very, very common culture of, lads in their mid-20s in England, doing some coke, going drinking, watching the football. And as a result, whilst I will hand on heart say that at the time he was one of my closest friends, the fact that we spent our friendship of 3 years doing those sorts of things means that we never took a photo together, and we never actually we did spend some quality time together outside of, those environments, but he never felt safe to share with me even, what was going on within him. And I felt like if anyone was a safe space for him, it was me. And I didn't internalize that. I didn't beat myself up. Like, what more could I do? But I sat there and I realized, like, how could I have spent so much time with this guy and have no idea how much he was struggling? And that's kind of what then broadened my questioning and my curiosity beyond my own mental health. And I started questioning, like, okay, so you start hearing about suicide rates amongst men, and you start hearing about how common it is and how it's the biggest killer of men under 50 and all these sorts of things. And I was like, wow, what's going on here? And so, that sort of was the kind of trajectory that I went on to sort of start looking into this stuff and, I guess, becoming quite passionate about it.
Thank you for sharing that. You said after your spell of being depressed, that's what sparked a bit more curiosity and introspection about yourself, and you made some realizations. Do you mind if I ask what they were? What the significance was about that relationship? Yeah. What about that, I guess, sparks everything off inside? Because I think that will resonate with a lot of people, that inner turmoil that we experience, that is just there. We didn't know it was there. We had no warning signs. There'd been nothing that alluded to that in the past. But then, almost like, a penny dropping, that's the moment. And all of a sudden, once Pandora's box is open, there's no turning back.
It does. So for me personally, and again, I think this is something that is very, very common within my experience, within the men I work with, the conversations I have. I've seen this to be something that's really, really common, and that is how much men, without realizing, end up seeing their value as inherently tied to the ways that they show up in things like having a partner and, I mean, all of the external things, but particularly in relationships, one of the biggest mistakes that men make is they subconsciously believe that their partner is actually responsible for their happiness. And so the way that that relationship ends up kind of building is on the foundations of like really severe codependency. And we're not actually saying to ourselves, we're not aware, we're not sort of speaking to ourselves and saying, right, well, my job is to make her happy, or him, or whoever you're dating. But my job is to make them happy. So therefore, they must be the ones who make me happy. And because that's the programming that is kind of deeply ingrained within us, we don't realize the harm that that causes. And so for me, I'd actually been through this quite regularly throughout my life, is that I'd get into a relationship after the kind of 6 to 12 month period, the honeymoon period wears off and you can't hide the parts of you that you feel ashamed or embarrassed or you don't want your partner to see. You can't hide them anymore. And that is often where my struggles in relationship would begin. In the relationship that I mentioned previously, she actually left to go traveling almost at like that peak moment where everything had just got so perfect in my mind. Everything was so great. All of the love and the happiness and all of the hormones were just absolutely spiking and everything was brilliant. And then she left me. Well, she didn't leave me. She went to go and travel and do what she had originally planned to do before we met. And I hadn't realized that I had invested so heavily. I'd put all of my eggs in one basket in terms of, well, she's now the source of my happiness. She's everything to me. So that when she left, not only did she take my happiness, but she took everything else with her. I mean, that was my responsibility. I had accidentally given her that power. I'd accidentally given away all of that agency, all of that autonomy, all of that power. And I've just gone, you are now responsible for my happiness. And it's quite a challenging thing to go through, to realize how much you fall apart when you do that. But yeah, I think the things that I realized were, some of the realizations that I had, and some of this was in therapy, some of this was in my own work, some of this was in a period of celibacy I did years later because I kept going through the same patterns and I was like, I need to just stop dating, I need to stop having sex, I need to figure some of this stuff out. I realized that on a deep subconscious level, I had been trying to heal. Basically, my mum and dad separated when I was like 16, 17. And one of the stories that I told myself about why that happened was because my dad wasn't emotionally present or emotionally able to support my mum. And that was one of the contributing factors. There were many. But as a result of that, I had somehow subconsciously picked up this practice or this process of what I'm going to do is I'm going to show up so emotionally and so presently, and I'm going to be so safe and so loving and so emotionally supportive to my partners so that they can never leave me. I wasn't saying that, but that was the programming that I was running on. So I was trying to go the opposite way to what my dad would do to avoid. My dad was actually quite devastated when my mum left him, and I was trying to heal that wound within me. So that was one of the reasons why I was giving so much away in partnerships, so much away to my my girlfriends, my the women that I was with. But that's why every time I tried harder to go deeper, to give more away, I was giving more of myself away. So that when things didn't work out, or when they would leave, or when I would get scared and walk away, it would almost take another piece of me. It would take another part of me. It would devastate me that little bit more. So realizing that I was giving away all of that power, realizing that I was actually outsourcing my happiness and making someone else responsible for that, that was a huge wake-up call, because it made me realize that that's actually, again, not to blame myself, but to take responsibility. The reason that I was so unhappy and kept coming up with challenges in relationships is because I wasn't taking responsibility for my own happiness. I was actually falling into a deep state of codependency, which is incredibly, incredibly harmful and unfair on my partner.
Yeah, I think that so much of that will speak to a lot of people. It certainly does me, because like most things, I think that disconnect those things that as you grow up and you look at other men that don't quite align with what you believe, it's all that program was subjected to, that programming that, from as young as whenever we're allowed to pick up those we begin to pick up those social cues around us, and we see how other men are, how their wives treat them. Because, I'm very conscious about my relationship with my wife, and whether we're arguing or not, or we're in a good space, like whatever that may be, is how that comes across to the kids. And when you were talking there, it's an incredible amount of that resonates with me, and I guess our beliefs around this gender normative kind of what men are there for, what women are there for. Like, men are needy on a very primitive, basic level, and does that need to be shown with the love being showered by their significant other and her looking after him, and he's out there as the provider of things. So I don't know, I feel like for certain men, at least, I can't speak for all men obviously, that fear of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, it taps into something deeper, like an inner failing of being a man and what it is to be masculine. And I know you corrected yourself, but you said like left me. Like that I guess that was your interpretation at the time. I know you don't feel it now, but that was your interpretation at the time. This was me. This was my fault. Even though she probably had plans of traveling for however long. And it's incredible how we internalize that, and that feeds into these feelings of shame. And because this is the result of something that I've done, I don't know. And again, I can only speak for men, or at least as a man, my experiences. But I think shame, rejection, and humiliation is such a part of that archaic thing of what men shouldn't experience. When you do experience it, it feels so much significant than it is, rather than this is just an emotion. It's not innately positive or negative. Everyone experiences, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sex. It's not all about me. Not everyone's world revolves around me. I may be the main character in my own movie, but not everyone needs to exist for this and me. And we internalize a lot of that. And it's only once you get a lot bit more, as you say, curious, and you go through these exploratory exercises, whether they be with a therapist or your own introspective work, is that you kind of realize the spectrum of emotions is something that everyone experiences to a certain degree, and it's all very different, but there are also quite a lot of similarities there as well.
Definitely. And just to go back to the can you,
James, just before you, is there any way you can change your 4K to that 1080 while we're recording?
Absolutely.
If not, is no bother at all. I think where your picture is so crisp.
Yeah, man. Let's change it.
The external, I don't want to say recorder. That sounds really primitive. That's essentially what it does. The cloud, I guess, recording is struggling to keep up. So it's actually affecting your sound.
Oh, is it? Shit.
It's all right. It's not a big deal. If you can't switch it, don't worry about it. It's only the odd lapses in that I'm missing. It may be just be my end. Your end, it might be absolutely fine, because this new software, this system that I'm using records both.
Yeah. Give me 2 seconds as well, man. It's absolutely drained my battery as well, so I just quickly need to charge it. Give me 2 seconds. Fucking technology, man.
And this interjection is brought to you by... This is where I promote all very questionable supplements and products that everyone else seemingly promotes. This is where I start selling a greens drink, perhaps.
Mate, I've got, you know when your laptop starts sounding like a fucking helicopter?
That's what mine does all of the time, but I'm pretty sure that's just a bit old.
Yeah, so...
Is that better?
Yeah, I think it is. I've got like 25% battery left. And like, when you've got everything plugged in, like your mic, your camera, your fucking display, all of this stuff, like it's just, it's so hard. I just want to fucking record a podcast, and I just want my tech to work. That's all I want. Not too much to ask.
Yeah. Sorry, I retracted and
No, I was
interrupted
going
your
to
answer.
say we were talking about. I wanted to bring it back to the father wound stuff because I think that's you make a really good point there, and like one of the things that we don't realize is that like the father wound can like we can have emotional like the father wounds can sometimes sound like a bit of a hippy dippy kind of like it sounds like a little bit of a spiritual term or it sounds a little bit like it's hard to connect with, but what we're ultimately talking about.
The truth of it is, everything sounds like an
Yeah,
Insta soundbite, Insta therapy
it
soundbite
does.
these days, because I feel nauseous saying stuff that I mean, but it's so overly used or used in the wrong context
Exactly.
sometimes that it just
But what we mean by that is
it becomes
basically
void.
it's the emotional wounds caused by our fathers, and we all have them. Now, one of the hardest challenges that we have. Let's just speak into men's experiences, but anyone can really kind of delve into this. Is if we had fathers who were actually present in the home that demonstrated quite a lot of quite desirable or admirable traits as a father, if they tried really hard, if they showed up for you and I don't know, took you to football training or would work whatever. Like I have so many lovely memories with my dad. Took us on holidays, always played with us, really did his best. And so for many years, I believed that my dad was I put my dad on a pedestal. I thought he was this brilliant, wonderful, loving, kind, man. And he was all of those things. I'm not saying that he wasn't. But sometimes, I say sometimes, often, that makes it even harder to see where the emotional wounds of the father come from, because you see what's on the surface level. You don't see the kind of potentially harmful and often toxic kind of relationship dynamics that are at play, because your dad's always been your dad, and especially if he's always been present and he's always been in the home and he's always tried really hard, and he lacks the self-awareness and doesn't own things like his short temper, his gaslighting, his inability to take responsibility, the fact that he never apologizes, that whenever he does something to upset you or hurt you, he'll avoid it, won't talk to you for a couple of days, and then carry on like everything's normal. The fact that every time he upsets you and you try to speak to him about it, he makes you the one who is being too sensitive, or you were the one who misinterpreted and didn't understand what he meant, and you're too deep and you don't see how harmful that is and how how that can fuck you up, because he also does all of the other things, and he also tries really hard, and he also loves you. So that's an example that that a lot of that was speaking to my own experience. But then obviously you get the dads who actually were more overtly abusive and toxic and physically abusive and more obviously emotionally abusive and aggressive. And you also get the dads who just were not there, who were absent, who just did not show up for their kids. So, the father wound can be anywhere in and amongst those things. You can have a dad who really tried his fucking hardest, and on many fronts was a great dad, but actually, in not having the self-awareness to heal his own wounds, he passes all of them onto you or inflicts them onto you, whilst really trying hard not to. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, is learning to identify those and actually work through those and not have them impact us anymore.
Yeah, that's something I think you only really understand once you are an adult yourself, is because I think both your parents, really, regardless of whether you got two, one, whatever that may be, you don't see them as humans. They are just your parents, and everything they do should be perfect, and they should have all this stuff now. You don't think about, obviously they've got their own history and the things they went through. I did not have a present father at all. My parents divorced and remarried each other twice. I went through that when I was 5, and then they got back together. My sister was born. There's like 9 years between us. And it happened again. He was abusive, emotionally and physically. He was very aggressive, very emotionally shut down. And to be quite honest, I was at a fucking loss, because I didn't know what a man should be, and everything was made to feel like my fault very much of the time. Just by interpretation, I was actually told those things. So that had a real impact impact on me. So actually, when we speak about like the father wound speaks to me more than the mother wound, obviously there are aspects there, and we'll leave my mum out of this for today, but there are elements, but part of that dynamic and part of her navigating her own safety and part of her managing him because he's unable to regulate and manage himself was neglecting me on some parts, not consciously. Like my mum's wonderful, but as you say, the best intentions for everyone, someone is gonna in that dynamic suffer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not always a conscious thing. So it was very much, and I don't mind sharing these things. It was very much that when he was around, although he was always absent, because he was never present, we never did anything together. I was kind of just the spare part. It was no, I don't want to say abandonment. That seems like an extreme use of the word, but he was priority. So I guess my mum running around or walking around on eggshells to manage him, it was almost like, it felt like a withdrawal of
absolutely.
love.
And I appreciate you sharing that, man. It's, yeah.
No, that's fine. Because, I think when you can objectively look at these things, and I've had many conversations with my mum, she may or may not listen to this. So sorry, mum, if you do listen to this. I can honestly reflect and say she did her absolute best. I can't honestly reflect and say he did his best, but then I know he had a very traumatic upbringing as well, and that's certainly not to excuse his behaviour. But the interesting dynamic of this is I find sometimes how that feeds into a miniature replica of what you were experienced to, which quite a lot of men will be familiar with in terms of dynamic. Like bullies have often been bullied. Abusive men can turn into abusive men, maybe less so. Whether they were physically abused and they turn into an emotional abuser, or you get what, again, it's a cliche, isn't it? Cycle breakers, which is just like, fuck, no, I'm not passing any more of this on to any other human. I'm going to be everything that you weren't to make a point, because I don't want my children being affected in this way. How has that changed you?
I want to come to that, but there's a couple of things that you shared there that I think are brilliant, and I wanted to kind of touch on, because you mentioned about cycle breakers, and I think that one of the biggest issues that that we face in terms of this thing of like generational trauma and the fact that stuff gets passed down, right, is that many people have children and they do say to themselves, right, I am going to make sure that I absolutely do everything it takes to do the opposite of what my parents did. I'm not going to do what my dad did to me. I'm not going to do to, I'm not going to do to my son or to my, to my children. And there's a really beautiful intention in that, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that you don't harm your child in the same way. But one of the problems with that is that when we try to avoid inflicting harm and we go the complete opposite direction, that isn't necessarily what that child needs. So, for example, let's just say your dad never played with you and never had fun with you, and he was really cold and he was really dismissive and he just showed no interest in you. Well, that then leaves a wound on you, and you grow up and you go, right, I'm not going to do what my dad did to me. I'm going to be the most fun, the most playful, the most affectionate, the most, happy-go-lucky, brilliant dad, and I'm going to make sure I don't do that same thing to my son. Well, that's really beautiful and there's really lovely intention there. But how do you know that that's what your child needs? Does your dad, does your child always need you to be playful and everything's happy and brilliant and everything's fun all the time and everything's brilliant and everything's great? Actually, often what you're doing is you're trying so hard not to hurt your child that you're actually not present with your child's needs. And what can happen is, there will be times where your son, for example, actually needs, it could be advice. It could be that your son needs to be, lovingly shown, no, you don't do this, disciplined. He needs to be given counsel. He needs to be given wisdom. He needs to be, educated. He needs to be shown that things are okay if he's learned, he needs a dad. He needs a father. He doesn't need a best mate that's always having fun. And he's always just, everything's brilliant and fun and funny. You might have guessed, but that's exactly what my dad did. And one of the hardest things for me to realize was that I could always see my dad's intention. I could always see how hard he was trying, and I could always see all of these brilliant things. What made it even harder was everyone else saw him as well. Everyone else, all friends, and this is what got really hard was as we grew into it, as I came into my adulthood and I came into my 20s, into my mid and my late 20s, my dad was still around, and he kind of had started reveling in being like the cool dad who was just really fun and loved coming for going for the beers and playing golf with his son and his mates. And it was just brilliant in all of these ways. And it was so brilliant that I couldn't see all of these problems and all of these challenges and all of this trauma and all of these needs that I had that my dad never fucking met. And as a result, because I couldn't see what was objectively, and this isn't to blame my dad, because my dad did his best, right? But I couldn't see where my dad had failed as a father. I couldn't see where my dad had caused me harm as a dad who didn't make me feel safe around, who taught me an awful lot of shame. He taught me he taught me to feel embarrassed over a lot of parts of myself, accidentally. But I learned so much of my own wounds and my own pain come from the lessons that I'd learned from my dad. So I heard a brilliant thing, and I guess I'm kind of, to come back to the cycle breakers thing, is it can be a beautiful intention to make sure you don't impart the same wounds on your children. But the way that you do that is not by doing the opposite. It's by taking responsibility for your wounds and healing them. Because what will happen, it's unavoidable. If you have children, they're going to grow up and the world is going to fuck them up. And you are going to fuck them up. You are going to impart, some of your own shit. And it's going to, no matter how hard you try, right? But rather than trying to protect your child from the wounds of the world, what you can do is you can say, I know that the world's going to hurt my child. So rather than try to protect them, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be a demonstrator of healing, taking responsibility for and healing my own wounds. So that when my son or my daughter, my child, comes to me later on in life and says, Dad, I'm fucked. I'm going through this. This has hurt me. I don't know how to do it. I don't try and fix it for them, but I can show them that here's how I've done it. Here's what support you can actually guide them in a way. And that's more what they need.
Yeah, that's definitely been a learning curve for me. Because as you say, I think I did describe it as going the total opposite, but it's, I guess, being more attuned with their needs. And because there's two of them, there's different needs between them at different ages and different challenges and everything like that. But communication is a big thing in our house, is that we talk about stuff, which is one thing I never had, that there is that safe space, there is that emotional safety. And this sounds really, really cheesy, but it wasn't something I prompted her to say. She just came out with it. My daughter said not so long ago, I feel really safe at home. And actually, I started tearing up a little bit because it's nothing I expected her to ever say. It's nothing I've consciously focused on. And in that moment, I thought, oh, that's really quite important.
Well,
and I never had that. I think that's why it hit me so hard, because I never felt safe at home, emotionally or physically safe at home. And she said that, and that really caught me. So it's the lessons you impart that you don't even mean to. But as you say, the world's hard, the world's awful. And you want them to go into it. It's interesting because I had this discussion with the gent I had on the last podcast, is that you don't want them to go through what you went through, but also you want them to cultivate some sort of resilience. You don't want them to be, because the world is awful, you don't want the world to swallow them up. So even if it's mild disappointment, just saying no to them sometimes, not letting them get their own way, disciplining them, as you say, in the most loving kind of way. But I have to experience, even if it's the seemingly benign hardships at home, because I don't know, like I meet a lot of people that, I don't want to be too presumptuous, but it's clearly they haven't experienced much challenge. So everything is an expectation, is they are entitled to a certain amount, and world is unfair, and, that's not fair, and that's not acceptable. That is, unfortunately, the state of the world. It is very unfair. There is no justice, so to speak. I don't mean to sound like one of these elitist Insta video clips, but it will just swallow you up unless you develop some sort of resilience, whether that's through your parents or some of the stuff that you would hope no one goes through. There are so many avenues of conversation I would still love to go through with you, but I'm also very conscious of precious time. The one other thing that I kind of wanted to address with you, which actually only popped into my head during this, is how the subconscious programming we're all subjected to feeds into women and their expectations of men. And there's pressure for men to be vulnerable. So it's almost like we go through this introspective journey of tapping into what that means, developing the communication skills, refining the vocabulary in which to convey them, and actually being able to pinpoint them, having that emotional granularity to say, I'm not angry, I'm just really disappointed. I'm really disappointed because I felt rejected, and actually that feels quite humiliating. And, that taps into some other deeper rooted sense of shame. Is men are encouraged to be vulnerable, but not always are. And I'm talking about from a gender normative relationship, man, woman. Women aren't always equipped to deal with men when they're vulnerable because of what they've been exposed to, and their father wounds and their mother wounds, and how they see them growing up. Because I know you have, I'm sure I've definitely seen you talk about this before, and a lot of it resonated with me, and I wonder whether you could give me your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think this came up in our Instagram live that we did. And
perhaps it did.
Yeah, I've had some good discussions around this because, there's been a lot of encouragement in recent years for men to be more vulnerable, and that is, as a starting point, a good thing. But what we've seen as this starts to happen more and more is that men can become kind of, I spoke earlier about my challenges within relationships, is that I would end up funneling and kind of like channeling all of my emotional vulnerability and all of my communication into my partnership. And that would become incredibly overwhelming for my partners. It was burdening them too much with the responsibility of actually ended up playing a role of therapist, carer, almost like mother, like they almost become someone who just cares for you. And so not only have you got that, but you've also got men who've grown up struggling to articulate themselves emotionally and to be vulnerable. You've got women who've grown up believing the same things about male vulnerability and male emotions. They might, on a surface level, unconsciously realize that men need to talk, but actually in the moment when it happens, it can bring up a real severe discomfort, and it can bring up, it can make women feel really uncomfortable and dysregulated and kind of not know how to deal with it. And so when that happens, when a man is open and he opens up in front of, a woman, and the woman doesn't know how to hold that, well, that immediately, even if it's just the woman could try really hard, but if her body language and her energy and her nervous system is, going, fuck, this feels really uncomfortable, well, a guy in his vulnerability is going to be incredibly attuned and sensitive to that. And so he's going to realize that she feels uncomfortable. That's going to send him the message that, oh, see, I've opened up and now I'm being judged, or I've made her uncomfortable. And so it reinforces the original belief that I shouldn't open up. So I guess the way to combat that is that, number one, is you need to have multiple different areas and sources of, or spaces that you can go to. You need to have multiple spaces that you can go to really practice vulnerability and to engage in opening up and talking about what's going on internally. For men, this is one of the biggest reasons why men's spaces are vital, because doing it in the presence of other men, you've got shared experience, you've got a degree of, don't get me wrong, it can be scary as shit if you have never sat in a men's circle or never spoke to another man about how you're feeling. But when you do, you are doing it in the presence of other men, so there isn't that fear of how is a woman perceiving this. So having, multiple different areas, so whether it's a men's circle or a men's group, you can have, a therapist if you have access to one, if you can access one. You can practice what it's like to speak to one friend. You can kind of check in with which of your friendship group actually has a desire to support you, and who can speak to you at that deeper level. You might have a bunch of friends that you hang out with or go to the pub with, but there might be that one that you can just actually spend a bit more time with and be a little bit more intentional with the conversation. And you build up some options. And as you begin to do that, you'll obviously then learn how to be more vulnerable and how it feels to open up. And you're not putting all of your eggs in the basket of, well, I'm just going to be vulnerable with my partner. And you're not going to burden them with, again, this responsibility of being the person who takes care of you and makes you feel safe. Don't get me wrong, we all want to feel safe in our partnerships, but it's important that we maintain balance and that we don't make our partners, we don't want to outsource all of our safety and our responsibility for, holding our emotions and our vulnerability solely to them, because that's too much.
Thank you for that. That's far more articulate and well versed than what I normally say, which sounds a bit more crass in a nutshell. But it's essentially, I always find that there are different relationships that serve different purposes in our worlds. So even with friends, when there's something I desperately need to share, I've got burdened with something on my mind, is with other guys especially, last thing you want is to be vulnerable with a mate and them either not to disappoint you with their response, which is not their fault. It's just they're not equipped with that skill set, which is fine. They're perfectly happy. That's not down to them to be with that. Or that's met with ridicule and bants, and that's brought up in front of another group, in which that just makes you withdraw and not want to share. So as you say, I think it's really important just to have different relationships that serve different purposes, if that doesn't sound too gross. But I've got some wonderful friends, like some of my oldest friends that I grew up with and went to school with. They would do anything for me in a heartbeat. But if I'm really burdened and I'm feeling really shit, they're probably not the person I go to because they won't know how to respond. I will feel humiliated and embarrassed, and they might end up saying something inappropriate. That's not their fault. I've kind of set them up for that. So I've learned, time gone by, don't set them up for failure. Don't set myself up for failure. Thank you so much. Just in case anyone, which I'm sure they will, wanted to find out a little bit more about you, where can they go? Have you got any programs that you're running? Anything you'd like to promote?
Yeah, I'd say Instagram's brilliant. The work that I do, I work with men one-to-one, in sort of coaching and mentoring. So just come and find me over on Instagram. So it's at @JamesOliver_men's coach. But also the stuff we talked about sharing in spaces. I also run a men's community or a men's group called One Brotherhood. And you can follow us on Instagram. It's at We Are One Brotherhood. At We Are One Brotherhood. That's just a great entry point for men looking for, a little bit more authenticity, a bit more depth. We run events at gyms. We've got some retreats coming up, February, March. So come and check us out. And if anyone has any questions, feel free just to drop me a DM. I'm always very, very grateful to hear from anyone, really.
Amazing. Thank you. I appreciate you. Thanks for your time today.
It's been great to be here.